Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little. I'm here today with episode 164 of Weekly Poker Hand, and we have a fun one today. Here we have pocket jacks in the big blind playing 25 big blinds deep. So 500, 1,000, 25 big blinds deep. A tight aggressive guy raises from the button to 2,200, and I'm definitely going to re-raise this and just be fine getting it in. Seems obvious, seems standard, hands over. But no, it's not. So first thing you want to ask yourself in this spot is, should I be shoving or calling? Shoving or re-raising small to induce, and to induce your opponent to shove. As your opponent is going to shove over your re-raise with all sorts of garbage because he thinks you're re-raising small to just try to steal it cheaply without shoving, thinking that your hand's not good enough to risk going all in, well then you should certainly re-raise small and then just be very happy calling it off. And we are trying to call it off here. If I make it 5,500, my opponent shoves, I'm calling every time with pocket jacks. Happily. So that's a great play against players like that. If you think your opponent's not going to re-raise you very often if you make it 5,500 and he's going to call a lot, you should probably just be more inclined to shove all in. I know the shove is a little bit big, but it is 25 big blinds over a 2.2 big blind raise. So it's a little big, but it should have a lot of fold equity, and that should allow you to shove with a decent amount of bluffs. So either way, I'm okay with this. I would usually say that I'm just going to go all in here, but 5,500 is certainly fine, and I probably end up doing that like 40% of the time, depending on the opponent. I'm not going to call very often from the big blind, by the way. Pocket jacks is not good enough to slow play. I may call with pocket aces here, because that hand is good enough to slow play, but with the jacks, I don't think it's necessary. Jacks is going to get outdrawn a little bit too often. So I do make it exactly 5,500. So that's nice. And the opponent calls, which is not really what I want, but it's fine. You know, it's not like a disaster when he calls. And especially not a disaster when it comes queen jack 9 like it does. All right, we have a set. Sets are good. We can either bet or check. At this point, we're not really concerned with being outdrawn. Obviously, a king or a 10 or an 8 are particularly bad turn cards, but it is what it is. That said, this should really hit my re-raising range pretty well if I have all the big cards and big pairs in my range. I mean, here it is. We just have it, right? So I think we need to bet here. Notice the opponent could very easily have a queen for top pair. He could also very easily have a 10, like ace 10 for a straight draw. And all those hands are going to call a bet. So I definitely like betting. I don't think we need to go too big. I think really 5,500 again is fine. And I do bet 4,200. So a little bit less than my pre-flop raise. And like I said, a small bet is perfectly fine here. So I do bet small, and the opponent calls. The turn is the king of diamonds. So one of the cards I didn't want to see. Now if our opponent has a 10, he just has us in pretty bad shape. The pot's 21,000 already, and I have 15,000 behind. I think some people just kind of mindlessly shove in this spot thinking, oh, well, I'm clearly going with it, so I might as well shove. But I think that's actually a pretty big mistake, because here, if we check, our opponent may decide to turn a hand like ace 9 into a bluff, or he may actually value bet king queen or king jack or king 9. So I think checking with the intention of check calling here is going to be pretty nice. So I understand that we're going to be behind a lot of the time when we do check call it off. The thing is, we have all the outs to the full house, so we have basically the best draw. And sometimes by checking, you'll induce a bluff. Whereas if you shove, now your opponent's going to fold out most of the hands besides straights, and that's not going to work out so well for you. So I like checking. And the opponent checks behind. So when he checks behind, I don't think we're against very many straights. We're probably against random one-pair hands like Jack 7 suited, and maybe hands like Ace Queen, maybe Queen 9. I mean, maybe he does have the straight and he's slow playing. I don't think this is a bad spot to slow play with a 10. If you do have a 10 here, notice that if you shove, your opponent's probably going to fold out a lot of his one-pair hands and all of his bluffs. So if you check back, maybe you can induce your opponent to bluff the river. And of course, you're going to call on basically in river if you have a random 10, like Jack 10. Besides, I guess a 10 would be a particularly bad river. So anyway, I think it's hard to know what the opponent's doing in this spot, but I would not discount him having lots of nut hands at this point. So the river is a fun card. It is the 10. So now the board is Queen Jack 9, King 10. So there's a straight on the board, and an ace makes the straight. So now I want to ask myself what my flop betting range plus my turn checking range looks like. I think it's going to be a lot of hands like Ace King, Ace Queen, Ace Jack, maybe hands like Ace 5 of clubs, Ace 4 of spades, stuff like that. So these are all hands that I would likely bet in these spots and then just check the turn because the turn's particularly bad. And a lot of those hands have the nuts now. So I certainly do have plenty of aces in my range. My opponent could have a lot of aces in his range too, but notice if he has a hand like ace-5 on the flop, he's just going to fold, right? Even if he has ace-5 of spades, he's probably just going to fold. So I should have way more aces in my range than my opponent. And for that reason, I certainly need to bet here as a bluff with some portion of my range. In reality, it would be way better if I had a hand like 6-5, because with 6-5, notice I don't block my opponent having any of the random 2-pair hands on the board. And that's going to make my opponent way more likely to fold. I happen to have pocket jacks, which is not really the ideal bluffing hand, because when I have pocket jacks, notice my opponent can't really have as many queen jacks, king jacks, jack 10s, jack 9s, etc. And that means my opponent's more likely to have other cards in his hand, like an ace. But that said, this is a spot, given I have such a big range advantage, I think we need to be betting. And here, the pot's 21,000, I have 15,000 behind, and I like to bet 6,200. So a relatively small bet. But this is exactly what I would do if I had an ace. I'm not going to shove if I have an ace, because, well, the opponent's just going to fold a lot, I would think. And also, if the opponent does have an ace, he's never folding, right? So this is a spot where if your opponent doesn't have the ace, he's probably going to fold to most reasonable bets. And I do think 6,200 is reasonable. But if he has an ace himself, he's never ever folding. So I want to risk the minimum I possibly can with my bluffs, assuming I have a bluffing range. And if you're playing against competent opponents, you just have to have a bluffing range. If I'm bluffing with every single hand here in my range, it's probably too much. But I like this play. We definitely need to be betting some portion of the time. The problem is if I check, and we get shoved on, I'm so unhappy. And by betting ourselves, our opponent's almost never going to shove as a bluff here, I don't think, just because it's so easy for me to have the ace. And given my opponent's very rarely going to bluff, I like betting here a lot. If this was perhaps a different scenario where we were much deeper and our opponent could raise as a bluff and still fold to a jam, then I would be a little bit less inclined to do this. But even then, I think this is a pretty nice spot to go for it. Again, anytime you have a pretty nice range advantage, because like I said, I have way more aces than my opponent, most likely, you can get away with making these bets. And I think we're going to get called here some portion of the time. Notice, though, that if my opponent is calling for a chop, he's putting in 6,200 to try to win only half the pot, 10,000, right? So he has to win way less often than it may initially appear. So in this scenario, should my opponent call with a chop? I don't know. I don't know at all. It certainly is a crappy spot. As your opponent plays better, meaning they're going to have more bluffs in their range, or at least they're playing somewhat balanced, you should definitely be more inclined to call. In a tournament setting where the chips you lose are worth more than the chips you stand to gain, I think you need to be more inclined to fold. But if you're playing against someone like myself and you see someone making a weekly poker hand video about how they have bluffs in this spot, well, you probably just need to make the call and pray for the chop. So does the 6,200 get through? It does. And we win the pot. And that's a lot of fun. It's always a lot of fun to win the pot. One interesting thing about this hand is that I'm trying to think about the last time I turned a set into a bluff. It almost never happens. I don't think it's ever happened in my whole life. Yet, here it is. We have a set in a 3-bet pot. We end up turning it into a bluff, and somehow it works out. That's going to be it for this episode of Weekly Poker Hand. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, definitely let me know on Twitter at Jonathan Little. I'm always happy to reply to any questions you have. And if you want me to review a hand or two for you, post it on Share My Pair, send me a link on Twitter, and I'll certainly reply. Thank you very much, and be sure to check back next week for another episode of Weekly Poker Hand.